Hi, everybody. Hope everyone's had a nice break. Hope everyone's enjoying the conference this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you're at. So these informal discussion sessions are meant to be just that. They're informal, they're lightly moderated, they're centered around a theme. And I thought for the theme for this one would be nice to talk about idealism. We have the Berkeley papers going on this morning, and we had Haas's paper on Swedenborg. So I thought thinking about idealism and what does idealism mean, and centering around the claim that Berkeley is famous for making, that idealism is the philosophy of common sense, and it's really easy to eat ideas and live amongst ideas, much more so than material substance, as he famously said in the Three Dialogues. So I thought it might be kind of nice to think about, why it is that if idealism really is just common sense, why is it that people like students, but many philosophers are so resistant to it? Why is it that we don't seem to want idealism if it's really so ordinary and so easy to live within it? So I thought that would be the question that we could kind of the topic we could talk about today. So what do you guys think? Do you think it's easy to live our idealism or not? Do you think that students' resistance has more to do with their being committed commonsensically to a different philosophical view, or something else?
Well, I guess I could say a few things on this.
Please, Alistair, go ahead.
Well, I think a lot of students find the sort of classic objections to Berkeley to be quite convincing, and they're not entirely impressed with his responses. Like, for example, people are generally quite convinced that objects don't disappear when we close our eyes. And they also aren't particularly impressed with the explanation, well, oh, God continues to see them. Because they have this, most of them, or a lot of them at least, have an antecedent commitment to atheism. And so they just find those kinds of objections to be quite powerful. I'm not so sure they're thinking, oh, I couldn't live idealism. I don't know if that's the root of their resistance to it.
Well, thanks for that. Colin.
Thanks. Yeah. So this is sort of like a question for the room, and like something that I talk about with my students when I'm trying to get them on board with idealism in the context of an early modern class. Is like, so in the period, if we're talking about Christian philosophers who typically think that God conserves and maybe like concurs with a lot of creation, you have God kind of holding everything up. And then if you add on to that God's like conservation and concurrence of reality involves some kind of like perception of all of creation, it looks like Berkeley then like doesn't look as wildly different than anyone else. So I guess there are things you can say there that, like, for Berkeley, the existence of sensible things consists in their being perceived, whereas maybe for someone like Malebranche, the existence of a material thing really depends on it being perceived and like held up by God. But gosh, that sounds like a much kind of like finer line. So maybe I kind of want to say, like, maybe if you're a 17th century Christian who believes that God is holding the world in reality, then maybe idealism is like pretty close to that kind of common sense. I don't know how that goes down with anyone.
Peter?
Thanks. I missed the start. But I caught. But so I always try and emphasize the same thing. The Colin was just saying. It's like, yeah, you basically, the rules of the game were like you got to have God doing something, right? And Berkeley's like, well, if he's kind of doing it all anyway, why doesn't he just? Why do you need all the other stuff? I mean, that's like the second dialogue is basically him making that case. But I think something that I find with students, and it maybe depends on the way that you teach the dialogues or the principles or whatever you're teaching, is that sometimes they get the impression that God is being like snuck in somewhere along the line, and because it depends. Some classes I definitely, we're kind of going through the dialogues, and then we get to a point and someone inevitably answers the question like, well, what happens when I leave my room? And then you're like, well, it's still being perceived. And then there's kind of sometimes this collective groan, like, oh, okay. So maybe it's just like, there's this feeling that maybe he's getting snuck in somewhere, and there's something slightly, you're being conned in some way. I don't know. I just think that's something I've found sometimes.
So Gregory seems to be applauding you for that, Peter. So Shauna, how about you?
Well, I agree with what Peter said, especially in the presentation and the dialogues, that God sort of comes into the story a little too late. But honestly, I think it's part of, it's inculcated at a very young age, a distinction. I would compare it to the eradicable fact-opinion distinction that students bring to the class. That seems to infect all of our discussions. Like that they're taught at a very young age to make this distinction between facts and opinions, and it muddies their perceptions. And I think the same thing is true. They're taught at a very young age to make a distinction between what's real and what's in your mind, and those are not the same thing. And I think that they're coming to the text, right, with that distinction very firmly in place. Either it's in your mind or it's real, and those are mutually exclusive, and they don't understand what Berkeley is trying to say as a result of that. And I think that they come at all that almost doesn't matter whether the arguments are persuasive in themselves, because they're coming at it right from that bias. That's my impression.
Thank you. Todd.
So maybe this is just a product of some of the circles I'm more commonly a part of, but as far as I think there can be both atheological and theological reasons that people will have antecedent objections, because yes, on the one hand, as someone said a minute ago, many students come with an antecedent commitment to atheism that doesn't, sit well with trying to get their mind into the idealist framework. But at the same time, it's been very common in my experience for there to be pushback from the other side. If someone's Catholic, they really wonder about, like, well, how the hell do I make sense of transubstantiation now? If I'm an idealist, or even more generally, something like, even apart from that, there's just like the incarnation, which is supposed to involve in some way taking on human nature in more than mere appearance. And so I think that there can be, and there's a long tradition of like Christian idealists who try to like reconcile those aspects of the systems, but I think that I think you can get both the theological and atheological presuppositions working against against idealism, because precisely many of the students who might otherwise be most inclined have these theological baggage that it's not obvious how to reconcile with idealism.
Thanks, Todd. Alberto.
Well, if a student, well, sometimes I think it's true that in Berkeley we can see many theses that fits with common sense. Mainly, for example, I was thinking in the new theory of vision, how Berkeley explains vision and sense and the role of mind. And when you explain some examples, the students say, okay, that's I understand, and it's clear. But of course, when we talk about the role of God, And nowadays, that the students immediately, I think in my experience, when we said, well, now it's the role of God in his theory, so the students immediately have like, oh, I mean, it's like they have some prejudices and it's not so easy to explain it. So I think if we translate Berkeley's thesis, Berkeley's immaterialism today, as he explained that, it's not easy to understand and sometimes it's difficult. But at the same time, if we explain other things, probably in some cases separate with God, I mean, in some cases, and probably is not, of course, Berkeley's theory, as he will say, he would like to that we explain everything all together. But some things I think fix with common sense and the students can understand it. But yeah, it's not easy just to explain Berkeley's immaterialism nowadays, and the students suddenly say, okay, I realize and I agree with Berkeley. And well, that's what I say. I mean, some things fit with common sense, but not all. And this is the point that it makes difficult to explain it, that the students with 20, they are 20 or 21 or 25 understand it perfectly and agree with him. So there are some difficulties to teach him, you know.
Great, thanks, Alberto. Gregory, you had your hand up, but you took it down. Do you still want to jump in, or are you?
Yeah, I do. I wasn't sure whether I was raising my hand or not. It's not very clear whether that's what you're doing when you click the button. So, yeah, I agree with a lot of what you guys are saying. I'm not sure that it's necessarily that they're hardwired for a kind of atheism. I teach down here in Texas, kind of below the Bible Belt here, and I have a lot of Christian students who are resistant to Berkeley's idea, and I think it's mainly because they are philosophically hardwired toward materialism, right? Even if they aren't atheists per se, they are people who come to the table assuming that what I see, taste, touch, and feel is a matter of material substance. So when you suggest that what you see, taste, touch, and feel might be a matter of mind or some mental process instead, and that matter might not actually be a thing, there's a lot of resistance there. Yeah, and I think a lot of that has to do with how it's taught in the textbooks. The textbooks seem to indicate that Berkeley is nothing more, or at least a lot of textbooks do, nothing more than this conceptual link between Locke and Hume. And that he's really interesting and fun to talk about and can kick off some nice and interesting thought experiments. But other than that, he only kind of gets us from Locke to Hume, and that's really all he does. So, and I think that just feeds into this misunderstanding of Descartes and of Berkeley, and maybe kind of a misunderstanding of the Christianity he was trying to let his idealism service. So.
Thanks for that. I mean, I felt some kind of similar reactions or had similar thoughts to some of the earlier discussion. And I was going to want to ask if anyone had ever taught evangelical students. I taught at a fairly evangelical place earlier in my career, and it didn't help. And I find students are resistant in the first dialogue before we get to discussions about God, before we get to the third dialogue where we're trying to respond to the objections. So I wasn't convinced that it has to do just with the theological aspects. But Peter and Colin, you guys our hands are up again. Maybe you guys want to circle back in that way. So Peter, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I teach in Ireland, so it's relatively religious. Doesn't really help. It's also Irish, still doesn't help. Yeah, I think what Gregory was saying, I think it's to do with, I mean, I have a textbook over there called Empiricism, and it's like terrible. It's got a picture of Berkeley sitting on an invisible chair, and it's like he didn't really think that the chair exists. But I think what's interesting, right, is there's a real discrepancy between that and the way that Berkeley actually packages his own views. I think he's actually pretty good if you focus on the right parts of the principles in the three dialogues, making it like he clearly preempted these types of concerns. Like, I don't know, that there's two things that I think are pretty, like there's the gardener in the dialogues. I think that's effective. I'll tell you the tree is there because he sees it and feels it and so on. There's also the nice one where he talks about how would you rather eat sensible bread or material bread? Because material bread you can't touch, taste, bite into, or there's nothing to it. Whereas the sensible bread is great. So yeah, so that's, I guess it's like that's just something that I think is kind of interesting.
Thanks for that, Colin.
Thanks. So I also kind of want to second Peter's point that one thing Berkeley is amazing at is anticipating and answering every objection you can have. So I feel like sometimes when I talk about Berkeley with students, they don't necessarily like it. They don't necessarily believe it, but they kind of feel like Berkeley gets into this stalemate position where whatever move they want to make, he sees them coming and he's got a move to a counter move. So that's kind of cool. Also, just kind of thinking about whether Berkeley's idealism vindicates common sense. Obviously, it depends what we mean by common sense. And one thing that I think Peter's paper brings out really nicely is that both Berkeley and Cavendish are trying to vindicate what you might call the manifest image in various ways, or trying to do justice to the way the world is presented in sensory experience. So the way I have sometimes sort of structured my early modern classes is the first half is all about the rise of the mechanical hypothesis in figures like Descartes, Boyle, and Locke, and then Cavendish and Berkeley fighting back and trying to rescue kind of ordinary sensory experience, admittedly in very different ways. I don't know whether that narrative works, but I feel that's another way you can go.
Thanks. Elizabeth. Oh, you're muted.
Unmute. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't realize how to raise my hand or to type properly without the phone falling over. Thank you guys. I also agree, and I find it actually really interesting with comparing sort of students coming with an atheist background, well, kind of very rigid antecedent atheism, or from a religious perspective, there's this kind of problem with Berkeley. But so it just made me think, and I don't know what people are saying to this, but in philosophy in general, there seems to be this prejudice against talking about God from a philosophical point of view, because it's either tainted as a sort of a concept tainted by a set religion, or by just atheists, rejecting it. So I feel like Berkeley, in particular, being a kind of Anglican, very kind of moderate Christian, is allowing also with a kind of allowing for a slightly more, moderate way of talking about God. So I suppose maybe it's a one way in is to maybe open up that debate about what God are we talking about in a very independent way, which is kind of significant even for someone like Berkeley. But I don't know if that makes sense. I don't really know. It's just something that came to me now.
What makes you say it's more moderate? Oh, she muted again somehow.
You're muted again, Elizabeth. Yep.
Gotcha. No, I just meant that Berkeley's Christianity is kind of moderate. It's a very, well, I don't know, vast amount, but it's sort of that type of Anglican is very unorthodox. It's very individualist, and then you can say kind of what you want about God in a sense. You don't need to worry about a transubstantiation. You just have to think about how God relates to the individual, right? But so I guess I'm saying two things here. I'm saying something about that in Berkeley, but I'm also saying that in general in philosophy, coming in as students, they're either coming with this, either you're buying into a package of religion when you talk about God, or you're kind of an atheist who's just rejecting any concept of God. But I'm just saying that there maybe should be some more scope, which would then help and aid an interest or a more open mind in someone reading someone like Berkeley, if that made sense. Yeah.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Gregory.
Yeah, just in response, Benjamin, to your question about teaching evangelicals, I mean, my student body, there's a lot of purported evangelicals in the place where I teach. It's a small state school down here, but I will be teaching a research seminar on Locke, Berkeley, and Hume in the fall. So I'll let you know how it goes in December. I mean, we'll see.
Great, I look forward to hearing that. Thanks. Fabio.
Hi. I just actually wanted to follow up on something that Colin said with respect to sort of the teaching survey courses in early modern philosophy. And one thing that I noticed, just sort of in my experience with students, is that they get sort of sucked into this and they're compelled by the sort of the common mechanist view that, well, I mean, how do we get our ideas? Well, it's because, bodies act on our bodies, and whatever happens, and we get these ideas, right? And then they read Berkeley and they think, well, I mean, that's just how do we get our ideas then, right? I mean, there has to be a body if we're perceiving things like bodies ostensibly anyway. It can't really be any other way than by bodies. And then it was funny because we also did in the last early modern course that I co-taught was Lady Shepherd, and interesting because she has this kind of irony objection too to Berkeley, and it's along the lines of, well, I mean, you propose this common sense philosophy, or this philosophy that's meant to vindicate a common sense, and then your theory of perception seems to rely on this kind of imprinting that's a very mechanistic philosophy that you purport to undermine relies on, right? It's sort of the central crucial principle. And then students get really, they get really excited about that because it's like, yeah, like, what is going on there? Berkeley does seem to make this claim and to sort of rely on these kinds of principles and then do away with them, or in an attempt to do away with them. So in my experience, students just can't seem to grasp the sort of the sort of perceptual mechanisms in Berkeley's view, because they're committed to this the causal view, right? This mechanistic causal view about how we perceive. So I've always found that pretty interesting, just to kind of experience that. And to be honest, I mean, I've always been sort of partial to that myself. So I mean, when I read Berkeley, I think as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Fabio. Alberto.
Hi. Well, I was thinking, for example, in my case, when I teach in a public university, and in Mexico, the public universities are secular, all of them. So the students, especially undergraduate students, they start to study philosophy like feeling like atheists or agnostics or something like that. So when in this, probably it's in 5th or 6th semesters when we teach Berkeley, Hume, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, and it's funny because immediately when they heard the word that Bishop Berkeley, it's like, oh, come on, how is possible? Now next, no? So Hume is better because, I don't know, some theses of Hume and are close to science or something like that. But this is something, it's not really an impediment, but it's like kind of wall or a barrier where you have to cross and say, well, okay, I mean, it's a bishop or was a bishop, but there's many things that are not immediately, it's not just theology or things like that, and the students immediately have this idea. And it's sometimes a problem that in my case, I have to, figure out how to explain some theses, considering that, yeah, was a bishop, but not only a bishop, and has many interesting, it doesn't matter, but for them, in some cases, it's important.
Great, thanks. Hassa.
Hello. Again, this has been quite interesting discussion so far, but I think it's quite important to make clear when you are discussing with, let's say, religious people about early modern philosophy, that when someone like Berkeley or Swedenborg or Kant or even Descartes, when they talk about God, it's something quite different from Christian God, and it seems that people get this point, like you can even discuss with this kind of early modern philosophy with priests, because at least in Jagiellonia University, there are even sometimes like a Dominican priest have attended some classes as students, and you can discuss these issues very easily with all kinds of people when you notice that the concept of God we are dealing with in early modern philosophy, it's something quite different from the conception of God that's mentioned by any established religion. Like none of these philosophers is at all orthodox in any sense. So yeah, so I have found that there is such a big distance between philosophical God and then a theological God that you can talk about this philosophical God with anyone without much problems once you make the distance clear.
Great, thanks. Todd.
Yeah, I mean, speaking, not to tip my hand too much, but speaking as an idealist myself, the breaking point for me and my sort of way into it actually came vis-a-vis the scientific instrumentalism. I was holding idealism sort of at arm's length until I got around to the part in the third dialogue which I was dimly aware that like various forms of scientific anti-realism existed, but they had never computed for me, and Berkeley made that compute for me, and then it was off to the races reading, Bas van Frassen and, these types. And sort of what I realized is like, this system makes sense to me, but only if you're willing to like fundamentally reverse the way you're thinking about how like scientific explanation and causation is conventionally supposed to work. And at least in my experience, when Berkeley is taught, usually not a lot of time is spent on the scientific anti-realism angle. And personally, I think you need that angle for it to be compelling, because that's what I needed for it to be compelling. And well, it's going to be a hard pitch to a lot of students to in introductory classes to explain instrumentalism or other forms of anti-realism in a way that makes sense, or much less make the case that scientific instrumentalism is a matter of common sense. Like, that's going to be a hard sell.
Thanks for that. I think Margaret wants to say something.
Thanks. Yeah, I wanted to kind of build on what Todd was saying, because I really agree that if you're going to be able to understand what Berkeley is up to, as opposed to having sort of weird views about tables, you have to read all the way to the end, and when you do that, you get to what Todd's calling scientific instrumentalism. I don't want to fuss with particular terminology. So that I think that really understanding Berkeley is something other than a real weirdo with crazy ideas about God does require you to read the books from beginning to end.
Yeah, thanks for that, Margaret. And thanks for that, Todd. Thanks, everybody. So again, this informal discussion I find very interesting and fruitful. You guys, we can continue it. We are kind of in the official break. So if people want to go and get some lunch, we've got a long break because of the cancellation. So we'll return again at 13. Sorry, I got my schedule here. 13:30 Pacific time. So at 1:30 Pacific time. But if you guys, the room will be open if you guys want to keep talking amongst yourselves and everything. This is a really fascinating conversation. Thanks, everybody. And feel free, you can log out and then log back in. You can log in and out anytime. So you don't have to stay logged in the whole time if you want.